I'm JBigTicket23 from GreenPCGamers.com, and in this video we are going to show you how to access the iDrac 9 web utility on a Poweredge R640 server, as well as we're going to show you how to do some of the very important firmware updates through the iDrac 9 utility. The Poweredge R640 has a dedicated iDrac 9 port that is located on the left side of the back of the chassis. We are going to plug into our network so we can access the iDrac 9 web GUI via a client computer on our network. Most of the 14th gen Poweredge servers will have a dedicated iDrac port that comes standard with either Basic Management, Express, or an optional Enterprise license. Now that we have connected the dedicated iDrac port to our network, we have to find the IP address to access it. If your iDrac is set to factory default, the server will automatically assign an IP address that will pop up during post. We're also going to show you how to access the iDrac settings via the F2 setup. To access setup, press F2 during this post screen. Once in setup, click on iDrac settings. Then click on network. This is where you can change the settings for the iDrac network port. You also have the option to change the iDrac to one of the LOM network ports on the network daughter card or motherboard if you'd like. We are going to leave ours as factory default and access the iDrac via the DHCP IP address that was automatically assigned. We're now going to show you how to log into the iDrac via a client PC on our network. We're going to start by opening up a web browser. In our case, we chose Google Chrome. We'll then enter the IP address that we located on the R640 server in the hyperlink search bar to access the iDrac login screen. Most web browsers will require you to bypass a security protocol like the one you're seeing on the screen. It is safe to proceed. Now that we have reached the login screen, we'll use the default credentials to log into the iDrac. The default username is root, and the default password is Kelvin. The iDrac will normally prompt you to change the default password for security reasons. We are going to keep the default password for this test environment. This is the iDrac 9 Express web GUI. It is a great place to monitor your hardware and do firmware updates. We are going to show you how to do some of the vital firmware updates for the hardware that we have installed in our Poweredge R640. We'll be updating the BIOS, the iDrac and lifecycle controller, the power supplies, the H740p RAID controller, and the Broadcom 10 gig network daughter card. Keep in mind that the hardware in your server will most likely be different than ours, but we'll try to give you some good clues on how to translate the updates to your system. We'll start by locating the firmware updates for the power supplies. The Dell support page labels the power supply firmware updates by part number, so we'll have to locate the part number of our power supplies first. To locate the power supply part numbers, we'll click on the System tab and then the Power tab to gain access to the power supply information. Now we can locate the part numbers of the power supplies that we have installed, as well as the current firmware levels to see if they need to be updated. Next, we'll go to the Dell support page to access all of the available firmware updates for our Poweredge R640 server. You can either enter your Poweredge server model name or enter your service tag to get to the support page. Now that we have located the Poweredge R640 support page, we'll search for the power supply firmware updates. Once we find the matching power supply part number to what we have installed in our server, we can click on it to see what firmware level it is. The firmware update available is the same firmware version that we already have installed on our power supplies. So we'll skip that update, but if there is a newer version available for you, you'll want to download the update to a locatable folder on your desktop, and we'll show you how to install it with the other updates that we download later in this video. Next, we'll do the RAID controller update. To locate the version of RAID controller that we are using, we clicked on Storage and then Controllers. As you can see, we have the H740p mini controller installed. Now that we know what controller we have, we can go to the Dell support page to locate the correct firmware update. If you have an H330, H730p, or H740p controller, you'll want to select the SAS RAID dropdown. If you have an HBA330, the firmware is located in the SAS non-RAID dropdown. We like to rename the firmware update based off of the model controller we have to make future updates easier to find. Next, we are going to locate the BIOS and iDrac lifecycle controller firmware updates. It's as simple as heading back to the support page, selecting the correct updates via the dropdown, and then downloading them. An important note for the iDrac lifecycle controller firmware update: if you are running a version older than 3.31, you'll want to install the 3.31 update first before going to the latest version. Otherwise, the latest update will most likely fail. In our case, we are updating from version 4.20, so we can disregard doing any incremental or bridge updates to get to the latest version. The last firmware update that we are going to download is the network data card update. This update can be somewhat tricky to locate because there are quite a few network data card options, and Dell doesn't always specify in the iDrac which version is installed. We need to know the model of the network data card to locate the correct firmware. As you can see, Dell only specifies the card installed as a Broadcom Advanced dual port 10 gig base adapter. We ended up having to remove the top panel of the server to look at the physical network data card to determine what model it was. After a little deciphering, you can see that it is a Broadcom 57416 network data card. Now that we know the model of the network data card, we can go back to the support page and locate the correct firmware update. We have finally finished locating and downloading the firmware updates that we want to install. We can now click on Maintenance, then System Update, and upload the firmware updates. Once the updates are uploaded, we can click on Install Next Reboot to initiate the install of the firmware updates. Once the firmware updates have been initiated, the server will reboot and go through the following progressions. Keep in mind that your particular configuration may have other components installed that require urgent updates. We only went through some of the vital updates for our particular configuration. Also, be aware that there are other ways to update your firmware, like using a server update utility ISO, or by simply installing your updates through Windows if you have a standalone operating system installed. Comment below and let us know your favorite way to update firmware on your Poweredge server. If this video was helpful to you, please consider subscribing to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.